Hamilton municipal cemeteries are like museums, with their headstones serving as a record of our culture and social history. Through an enduring stone, they reflect personal and national sentiment, speak of love, pity, and patriotism, summarize lives of remarkable longevity, and remind us of lives lost through tragedy. Many of Hamilton's colorful characters and history lie buried in our cemeteries. The Cemetery Tour, The Stories in the Stones, tells their fascinating stories through free guided walking tours at Hamilton Cemetery. The Hamilton Cemetery is Canada's first and oldest municipally owned and operated cemetery, providing a lasting memorial, permanent tribute, and a final resting place to many loved ones. Hamilton Cemetery houses some notable burials. Early settlers such as Robert Land and George Hamilton, victims of the Desjardins railway disaster, and a large number of past mayors of Hamilton rest here. Former senators and American Civil War veterans of the War of 1812 can also be found buried in this historical cemetery. Robin McKee, local historian, will be our tour guide on this virtual Stories in the Stones tour.
Behind me is the Gatehouse. It is an iconic building for a cemetery. There are only two of these in Ontario, and the other one is in Kingston, Ontario. It is a designated property under the Heritage Act, and it was built in the 1850s as a dual-purpose building for the cemetery, as a chapel, and as a residence for the caretaker. This is the fort of the War of 1812, situated in the Hamilton Cemetery. It's a wonderful piece of architectural design by the engineers of the War of 1812. It was built straight across the isthmus of the Burlington Heights, and this was the land, the part where they were going to stop the Americans' invasion here. All that ended when they got new intel from Stony Creek. It was brought to Harvey here in the Hamilton Cemetery, which was not the cemetery at the time, but the fort, the British fort, during the War of 1812. Harvey separated his men. He sent 700 men at night in silence to attack the Americans as a surprise attack at the Battle of Stony Creek. The high water mark of the War of 1812 is Stony Creek. And if it wasn't for that new intel getting here and Harvey changing his tactics from a frontal attack and defensive position, we would be Americans today. By defeating the Americans at Stony Creek, from this fort, we are Canadians. Sarah Calder was a Victorian dynamo. She fought the second battle of Stony Creek. Let me explain that. She came up with a great idea for the centennial of the War of 1812, and that was to buy back the James Gage homestead and turn it into a museum. Funny thing, that's what we got today. But she had to get permission from the Wentworth Historical Society, run by men, because as a woman during that time, she could not own property. So she went to the men and they said, no, we want to put the Centennial Project at Smith Knoll, which was the epicenter of the battle, because that's where the Americans had their cannon. And they were right. But Sarah thought differently. So what she said, she kept bugging him, and they finally said, okay, if you can raise the money, we'll do two projects. So she went out, she did all sorts of projects, she got baking, exhibits, also parades, all sorts of stuff. She made enough money to buy the property back and make it into a museum. But before she did that, she set up the Women's Wentworth Historical Society, became the president of the Women's Wentworth Historical Society, and bought the property under the Women's Historical Society because women could not own property, but a society could. And the men never got a penny. And it was the women that went in, built the museum, and we have the museum today. It was one of the very first museums in Hamilton, and it was run by a woman and the Women's Society. Well, she didn't stop there. For the centennial, she wanted to build a monument. We have an iconic Stony Creek battlefield monument on the hill. She built that. And what happened again? More money was donated, and she hired the architect Rostick to build it, and we have an iconic monument for the centennial. And on the day, 100 years, she unveiled it. And who unveiled it? Was the Queen of England in Buckingham Palace. The Queen pushed a button in Buckingham Palace in London, England. That spark went under the cable of the Atlantic Ocean, came up to a little town in Canada named Stony Creek, and the veils dropped on time. That's the story. And that was 100 years after the Battle of Stony Creek. She didn't stop there. She thought she looked a little bit like Queen Victoria. So she said Hamilton needs a statue of Queen Victoria because Queen Victoria just died in 1901. So she again gathered all the money up. She hired Hebert, a famous Canadian sculptor, and made the statue in downtown Hamilton by Hebert. We have a Hebert in downtown Hamilton. He had just come off the Parliament Buildings hill, and that's where he had just unveiled the Queen Victoria statue there. And he also did all the statues of the prime ministers around Parliament Hill. We have a Hebert. And on that downtown monument in Gore Park, it says, "A gift to Hamilton by the women of Hamilton." This woman is a hero, a Victorian hero. She fought the law, and the law was society, the men's society, and she never took no for an answer. And we have those iconic images and legends because of this woman. This is Nelson Stevens. You can see the stone today, but when I was doing the research, this was an unmarked grave. I researched the man simply because he showed up as a Civil War veteran. And then I researched it even more, and it turned out that he was a black Civil War veteran from Hamilton. I went to Washington, D.C., I pulled his file, and I proved that this Nelson Stevens in the Hamilton Cemetery was an ex-slave from Lynchburg, Virginia, and he went to fight in the Civil War. How did that ever come about? When the Civil War took place, the battle lines changed in Virginia, and Lynchburg was now in occupied territory by the North. They freed the slaves, and Nelson came to Canada. In 1865, he crossed the border and signed his death warrant by putting an X on his enlistment papers, and that X showed that he was illiterate. He went and fought in the Civil War down in Florida, and he ended up in New Orleans. Because he probably had a girl here in Hamilton, he came back to Hamilton after the Civil War, and he remarries a woman in 1866 here. In 1870, he kind of disappears. And the last time I was able to track him down, that he was in 3 shacks down Charlton Street West. Now, how did this all come about? I launched a tour, and a man came to me and said, "This is a great story. Here's the application for a stone." So I applied for the stone, and I got a call from the office, and they said, "Your stone's arrived, Robin." Turns out that this is an official American Civil War veteran stone that any American veteran of the Civil War should and would have if requested. The interesting thing about that was probably the very first Civil War veteran stone in Canada to a Civil War veteran in an unmarked grave who was a black man. And this stone was sent to me by President Bush.